29, Wisdom Part 2 summary. Yeah, that seems right. So we started by following up with what we talked about the couple weeks prior, because we had a week off for the holidays. And we just talked about the questions that we asked and just, what wisdom was and refreshed that. We also looked at, we started with some questions going into part 2. So a little bit of review as we went. So the first discussion question that was asked is, where do you turn for advice? And it was kind of interesting. I expected there to be some like this person, and we had talked about who do you believe to be wise or a wise person. And as we started talking through this, we realized that it changes, of course, who you go to for what. And, we had like best bud, best friend. Some people said they go to their kids, now their kids being older, some people in the group, are older, so their kids are, my age, maybe, or older. So it's not like a 30-year-old parent asking their kid. That was my point. Go to their mom. And then it was, and this is where we got to it was just kind of interesting. People, one of the interests was, well, who do you turn to advice? People that have relevant understanding of the topic that you're looking for, which makes perfect sense because people aren't wise in everything. So we talked about that a bit, and somebody that's well respected. So we got some we didn't get names per se. We got more general things, and it made sense, because then we were like, okay, well, yeah, you could be wise in something and not others. Now, I think wisdom is wisdom, and it's the ability to discern. But I think a wise person, if you went to them and they didn't know a subject matter, would tell you they didn't know. So then you would go to somebody else. So if you did have somebody that was wise, you'd go to them, and you could end up somewhere else because they didn't have an answer. So knowledge and experience, that's where it gets kind of weird. I shouldn't say weird, but it's a little muddy because somebody that understands computers per se, that was brought up. If it's a computer issue, I'm going to go to you, or that's not necessarily wisdom. That's knowledge and experience. But knowing what to do is, so it gets into that. Okay, then is it worldly wisdom? Is it, so that was the discussion there. So that, that's what we talked about. And then I asked this one, which I expected it to be fun. Think about a time when you felt wise, and then explain why. If you weren't there, think about a time when you felt wise, and then try to explain why. And there were different people that had different takes. Some people couldn't come up with anything, and we get to it later, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Others explained sometimes when they were mentoring somebody else, and again, there's no bad here, but so mentoring students that were on the wrong path, and there are specifics that I'm not going to give out, but and just in general, teachers navigating the rules of school to encourage opportunities to witness was one of those things. Like, how do you connect with people in places that you're not really allowed to witness? And wisdom allows you ways to do that and paths to do that. Now it's kind of discussed. There's some different tactics or different things used, or different ways of approaching it. Where somebody just came in and you didn't know what they were talking about, but they saw a picture on a wall and asked about it, and the picture was related to something faith-based. I'm being general, but that was one of them. And then just the opportunity in a conversation to speak to somebody, like when there's an opening, the wisdom to see that opening and to speak in a way and to act in a way that's not hitting somebody over the head with it or any of that. So those are some of the things, and that came along with the mentoring as well. meeting people where they're at. Helping someone that's struggling mentally and emotionally is another one, where listening is very important, and that's a big part of it. So those were the explaining why, and then where you felt wise. And yeah, I mean, I don't know, half and half maybe. Half of the people came up with different things, and the other half, didn't. And that's not a good thing or a bad thing per se. It's just what it was. And as we continued to talk later, there were people that mentioned, well, I told another one there, well, you're wise. This is how you act. You have wisdom, and that I don't have. Well, part of wisdom is being humble. Part of wisdom is saying I don't know. And if you're truly wise, you don't tell everybody what you know. You don't really understand. You don't really know that you're that way, because it's not you, it's God. So there's a humility there. So, that was discussed, and we went through that. We talked about the books of that are attributed to Solomon. I asked that question: what Bible books were attributed to Solomon? And there are 2 that are attributed to Solomon, and then some Psalms. But it was the first 2 books that we studied the last time. We didn't study the books, but macro studied, like watched the videos about them and talked about them and went through what the large scale stuff was for Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And it's important to know that Solomon wrote those because they're very different books, but the same person wrote them. And then we dove into why. When were they written? Why are they so different? What happened? What was Solomon's path? And we talked about how he had the wisdom of God, asked for it, and then became worldly wisdom. He didn't rely on God, and he went down a path, which is when Ecclesiastes was written. So, or seemingly, say it that way. I don't want to talk definitively about this stuff. Speaking of which, there was, when we talk about Solomon, there was the Queen of the South that came to get counsel from Solomon. And in the group, I believe I said it was Cleopatra. It was not. I was wrong. It's the Queen of Sheba, but the Queen of the South, they say is probably the Queen of Sheba, who's referenced. But I said I think it was. Anyway, point is I was wrong when I said that, so I want to get that straight. Queen of Sheba is who they really kind of attribute to the Queen of the South, which is from Ethiopia, if I remember correctly. Point is, there's not somebody outside, and that's what we said there. Somebody way outside of the kingdom that Solomon was ruling and around him came to get his guidance. He was known as the most wise, not only in his nation but throughout the land. And then we talked about the fact that he was the wisest person known at the time, and he still screwed up. He still did things that he shouldn't have done. And he became unwise because he wasn't connected with God. So that's why we go through that, and looking at reading Ecclesiastes, if you read it without the context of what it is, it's a very different book. So we talked about that. And then we went into, then we watched the video on so we reviewed those 2 books, and then we went to the third wisdom book, which is Job. So we watched the short Bible Project video. That'll be on 122 under the wisdom topic, under being real. And talked about Job. We talked about Job. Talked about the book of Job. And again, more macro level, the stories and the friends and how they interacted and things like that. And we really just looked at it at that level, because we wanted to go macro level so we understood when we went to verses, we had some context there. Talked about who wrote it, when it was written, that same kind of thing. Anonymous, by the way. They don't know who wrote Job. Job was written completely differently. It was written in a poetic? In a poetic way, Hebrew, Arabic, I think it was Hebrew, poetic. Anyway, it was poetry. That's the point. It was written distinctly differently than than the other two wisdom books, just in the format and all that kind of stuff. And we had discussion. Well, was it a story? It'd be easier to take if it was just a story and this didn't really happen to somebody. And we went through that whole thing, and we talked quite a bit about the book of Job and what you can glean from it, and how different times reading it, you can get something. You get something different. If you only look at it from the position of Job, there's not a lot of wisdom there. He was wise, and he was wise because he feared the Lord. Then we talked about what that means. What does fearing the Lord mean? Think about that for a second. I'll tell you what we came up with. So fear of the Lord is loving reverence. It's following his commands, loving him, and that's the fear of the Lord, because and that we got that from scripture and commentaries and other things. We went looking for what that meant, which I think is important, because you can't really do it if you don't know what it means. You can say it all day long. You can say fear the Lord. Okay, so I'm supposed to cower in the corner. Well, no. Okay, what is it? I'm not sure. You can't apply this stuff if you can't define it, if you don't understand what it is. So we did that, and it's like, okay, loving reverence, which means following these commands. Which means the path to wisdom is to do what God says. Then we talked about the commands, and then we talked about, well, what about the 10? Is it just the 10 commandments? No, and then we talked about, well, when Jesus was asked, remember when Jesus was asked about which one was the most important, what was his response? And it was the two, basically love God, love others. That's the shortest version that can give you, but that was the summation of what he said. And if you do that, you won't break any rules. So you'll follow all the other laws. So that's, the point is that you have to be close to God. You have to be obeying God, and then wisdom comes. You also have to ask for wisdom, but you can't have wisdom without fear of the Lord. That's the beginning of wisdom, according to Scripture. We read a few different places that said that very same thing, not just picking a verse and saying this is what it says, so this is what it is. Like we allowed Scripture to interpret Scripture. We looked for other things that could back that up, and we talked about that. In Job, it was interesting because as we talked about the book of Job, different people had different takes, and then kind of shifted a bit as we watched the video. Like it gave a different perspective, and just talking through some of that and how there's a lot of wisdom in Job if you're looking at it as a wisdom book. And I'm pretty sure nobody there looked at it as a wisdom book prior, or few. I'll say if the minority would have been the ones that saw Job as a wisdom book. They see it as bad one. Bad stuff happens to people. A suffering book. And I think that's the thing. But the wisdom you can glean from how the friends interacted, and the fact that Job followed Job followed the commands of God. He was a wise person. Didn't protect him from the bad. But the other thing with Job is we were just talking about this stuff where Job was mad at God, and Job's a book where you can look and you can see those types of interactions he had and know that it's okay. We talked about how it's not good to be mad at God, but it happens. It's a book more of hope than it is of suffering. But if you don't go into it with looking through the right lens, you're not going to get that. And we talked about that, and that's why we got context. And then we talked about the end of Job. I don't understand. God's answer was like no answer at all. So if you look at it that way, we always ask why. And God never answered Job why. I don't know. Seems like there's some wisdom to take from that. And there's some other things we discussed that aren't coming to mind right now, but it was interesting. The book of Job was a different look into Job, looking at it from a wisdom book and having those discussions and looking at it from different perspectives within the book itself. And I think some people got some different things out of it that they didn't before. So we went through that, those 3 books, macro level. Then we started looking at wisdom scripture in part 2. So in Kings, Solomon's established, he writes Proverbs. He's attributed to writing Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. So there were quite a few verses in those 2, which is why we had to have an understanding of them before we really dug in a little deeper. So we went into Proverbs like 1. And I'll put the verses from both 1 and 2 up here. So the beginning of knowledge is, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of the verses. What they say, don't lean on your understanding, walk with the wise. And as we were talking, it's like, yeah, well, you have to have people around you that are this way. We looked at that scripture, and that scripture, says that. Don't be with fools. And that scripture, Proverbs 13:20, in that area. And usually you read up and you read down verses. We do, multiple verses. But when it comes to like the Proverbs and things, that's kind of tough, because sometimes they shift gears pretty quickly on what you're doing, because it's like it's a statement and then a response, or the antonym of it, the opposite. So for those, it's kind of tough to do that. But yeah, 13:20 is walk with the wise. And then we reviewed a couple other things that we had looked at part 1. James 1:5-8. If you lack wisdom, ask for it. But here's the thing. Not James 1:5. James 1:5-8. And when you read it, you'll know why I'm saying that. Because in contrast to what I said about Proverbs, where you read a verse because that verse is, it switches topics, verse by verse in certain areas. It's not like a flowing book per se. But another scripture you definitely want to read up and down for more context, and so you don't cherry pick. You don't just grab one thing. Because if you look at James 1:5, it says just ask for wisdom and you're going to get it, basically. But there's more to that. You have to have the faith. I don't know. You're reading it. You'll know. We ended with how do we gain wisdom? And we went long on this one, a bit long. But how do we gain wisdom? I'll go ahead and put them up on the screen here. These are the different things that you can do to gain wisdom that we came up with. And these are basically your faith and action items, because to gain wisdom, it's a combination of all these things. And some of it's different for different people, like how you study and who you seek wisdom from. So that's going to be different for people, but the fundamentals are here. So that's what we came up with. That was a couple weeks, I don't know, about 4 hours worth of discussions and going to scripture and really a lot of contextually looking at things, a lot of higher level looking at scripture. We did go into verses, we did read scripture, everything was scripturally based, but it was trying to get a larger understanding, which, to be honest, that's what wisdom is. Wisdom is having a bigger picture of things, being able to see things that you don't see, that right away aren't apparent, is wisdom. And just knowing how it all connects. And actually God's answer to Job, him explaining what his wisdom was and how he understood how everything worked. Big picture stuff, big scale. So we stayed with that, and honestly not planned that way. It's just how it worked. And I think it was because of the topic and the guidance that we got going through it. So hopefully you get something out of this. Catch you next time. Keep being real.